Well, hello, and thanks so much for being with us today. The recent tragic death of George Floyd, it can't be called anything other than murder, injustice, and racism. Over these past 3 weeks, the reason that it's resonated right across our news feeds and our hearts is because it's a terrible injustice that has taken place. So it's really important that we do continue as a church community that is diverse to address this issue. And as a church, we've been doing that by reflecting and repenting so far. And as we prepare to respond, which is the phase that we're going into now, the first step is to listen and learn. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to listen. We're going to take a time to just shine a light on the reality for people in our community. And so what I've asked then is for a group of people from our church to just come and share their experience. And so I'm just going to ask them 2 questions as we do. And the first one is this: what would you say to people that think that racism isn't a problem in the UK?
So the examples I would give, mainly what I've experienced is othering, meaning whether intentionally or not, making someone feel like they're not quite part of your community, making them feel like they're not quite part of your circle. And I had that moment, unfortunately, as a teacher. I'm new to a classroom in the UK, and in a nice school that was really good. But when students asked where I was from, I said America, maybe New Jersey if they're really inquisitive. And I had a few students ask, no, but where are you really from? And I know what they mean, and it wasn't asked out of hate, and it wasn't asked to make me feel different, but it doesn't feel nice.
And I've lived in different places. I've lived in Leighton, I've lived in Stratford, I've lived in Crawley, I've lived in Middlesex. But I don't remember in any of these places racism being an issue until I moved to Guildford.
If I'm going to the theatre or a museum with my family, my brother and my dad will always get their bags checked twice. And it's the fact that I'm terrified of airports because I know full well that I'm more likely to get stopped, so I just avoid flying whenever possible.
So like in 2016 with like the Brexit referendum, I remember having a conversation in like the sixth form common room, and this guy was like, it's really annoying because my birthday was literally a couple of days before, so I couldn't even vote. But anyway, we were discussing like pros and cons for like Remain and Leave and whatever, and a white guy said to me, but it's fine, that the decision's easy for you anyway, because like if we leave, then like you're going to get kicked out of the country and shipped off to your country again or something like that. And I was like, A, that's really insensitive and inappropriate, and B, I'm British and I'm just as British as you are. I've been born in this country, my parents were born in this country, like it doesn't apply to me, A, and B, even if it did, it's really rude and unhelpful and racist, basically.
Yeah, even personally, I have not experienced racism directly. I've not been called any names or experienced. But again, applying, like when you apply for a job, there is always that doubt again about when they look at your CV and they see that where you come from, or your name, and your cultural background. That always worried me, because saying that I applied for jobs many times, and I've never had a call to an interview. So I was always anxious, even before I applied, that whether I will be called to an interview or not because of my background.
I remember the time there was this quite high-end store in the town center, and I remember walking in there and literally being made to feel like I didn't belong there. I felt it, just the way I was treated, and I remember just having to leave because I literally was made to feel like you don't belong in this store. Why are you here?
But I think also as well, like in an opposite sense, it's with that term white privilege that's been said a lot recently, and I'm sure many of you have heard it in recent weeks especially, but the white privilege thing in the sense of, I think for me, a lot smaller things feel like big landmarks when to anyone else they shouldn't and wouldn't. Like last summer, I was so excited that there were so many films with South Asian leads that were like blockbuster films at the cinema. When I say so many, I mean 3. Like, that's ridiculous. It was 3.
Yeah, and also like I remember in sixth form when we were talking about our first impressions of each other, and one of the girls who was my friend was kind of like, oh, I thought she used the B word, I won't say it, but she basically thought I would be that. And I was like, why would you think that? Like, you'd never met me before. Like, why would that be your first impression of me? And it's just that, like, often black girls are just assumed to be very aggressive and in your face and, like, confrontational. And, like, people just assume that, which is quite difficult because you're, like, given a label, basically, or assumed that you'd be a certain way because of the color of your skin, which is quite, like, frustrating.
We've experienced a lot of kindness since we arrived in the UK back in 2002. People have gone out of their way to help us, establish ourselves in the UK. So yeah, it is like, and again, to say that there is because through, even through friends, through stuff that you hear and see, there is racism. Maybe it's not as bad as some other places, but there is still racism in the UK. It does exist in the UK.
But what I have found in the UK, I think it's more, in some places it's more subtle, but you feel it and you know it, I think that we just need to, if I was to, respond to someone who said, does racism exist? And my answer would be, it does. It does to this day. It does exist. Because when when you're asked, like, where you from? And I say, like, if I say I'm British, they're like, no, but really, where are you from?
I think as well, as someone who is like doing nursing, I'm very aware of like the institutionalized racism, like in healthcare, which I would say, like, for people who would say like racism doesn't exist and that like the George Floyd case is like just an American narrative, like it does happen in the UK as well. I think it came up on the news, someone called Olaseni Lewis, who he had a mental health condition and he voluntarily admitted himself into a hospital, and there was an occasion where he became aggressive and 11 police officers restrained him, and he was starved of oxygen and later on died. And like that's more or less the narrative of George Floyd, and it happened in the UK. This was in 2010, and in 2017 basically the 6 of the officers were basically the charges were dropped and they got away with it basically.
Thank you so much, guys. And I think, with all of you, I kind of relate a little bit to everything that you said. So in the last 2 weeks, we moved offices a few weeks ago. And when I unpacked, it was in lockdown, so I unpacked the whole office, realised it was way too much for me to take all by myself. And so hired a man in a van, which was a guy from an Indian background, and he had his kind of late teen sons who came and helped. We got out of the van at the new offices, and I got out of my car, they got out of their van, and I headed towards the office and said, right, we're going to be going up there. And an elderly white man came out and said, oh, whoa, what are you doing? And I said, oh, it's okay, I've got keys, I've got paperwork, don't worry. And he said, oh, no, you can't come in. And I was like, no, we already rent this. We've been renting it for the last month. We just haven't been able to move because of lockdown. And he said, oh, well, you just have to wait. Let me call the owner. And whilst I was on the phone, he's like, well, what's your name? I was like, Chris, Hope Church, rah, rah. And he said, okay, you can come in. And what was worse, he then went on to say, I needed to make sure that you weren't coming here to rob the joint. Because that was his impression, that's what 4 dark-skinned people would be doing. And he even said, I assumed you had an empty van and that you were looking to rob the joint during lockdown. And that was just a couple of weeks ago. And I think that it's all subtle, but it's just in the last couple of weeks, something that I know I've experienced, and probably had the George Floyd thing. I mean, even in those experiences, I just went home, told Catherine, she was like, Chris, that's horrendous. And I was like, oh yeah, maybe it is. But I'm just so used to it that I didn't, and this actually is really helping me to reflect and to process lots of things like that happen regularly.
I think I do that too, that thing of like diminishing that something is bad. I'm just like, oh yeah, that was said. And then you say it to someone else and they're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe someone said or did that. You're like, oh, right, yeah, that's not great. But I think the assumption thing as well, like in terms of like people assume your background, I always used to get at school, like I remember especially in RE lessons, I was always very vocally Christian. And people would always still assume that I was Hindu or Muslim. But I think it is just that assumption of you're that skin colour, so that's your background.
I remember our solicitor kept reminding us before we got our citizenship to keep your head down. Just don't get into any conversations or anything, because they've had so many experiences from their clients who have, for example, someone just traveling in a train, and 2 white women on the other side. They just somehow made up a story that he was behaving, a certain way, and he lost his citizenship. His application was rejected. So like that, there were so many examples that our solicitor gave us and said, just until you get your citizenship, just keep your head down.
Let's go around one more time then. And so if you had 1 or 2 things that people in our church could do to make a difference, to support, or just to help each of us to experience life better, what would those things be?
Something that I've definitely found helpful is just making sure to actually seek out and learn about the experiences of other people. So I've been doing that by reading a lot recently. I just finished the book Between the World and Me. It just opened my eyes to a world I didn't really know existed. We all know what movies say, we all know what TV says, but to actually read a first-hand account of someone who's been in that situation, to actually read it, from their actual words, I found that really helpful in understanding, actually why people of color feel so oppressed and why they feel so much tension, because, it's just ongoing through years.
I think it goes back to what I was saying before about changing the way you think about racism. Because it's not a case of someone's a racist or there's not. Like, we're all capable of racism. So I think the first thing we can all do is, I know we kind of did it in prayer meeting, but like pray and repent. Pray for God to reveal and convict us of our own sin. And I know as a family we've been doing that this week, because South Asian communities are just as guilty of anti-blackness as white communities are, and we really as a family have been working through that.
Be yourself. You don't be afraid. Don't be, just be yourself. We don't bite. and just be yourself, be friendly, and just talk just like you talk to any other person. Regardless of color, just speak to people.
Another thing a friend and I thought of, a friend who's experienced a lot of racism, is with all the love in the world, we think it might be helpful to think, if you want to ask about someone's race, it's really, really nice that people are curious, and it's only natural that you want to learn a bit about someone, especially if they look different from you. But if you're to ask a question, if you wouldn't ask a white person, maybe don't ask a person of color, because obviously a lot of questions are not badly intended. I think something I've got a lot is correction over, my life. So especially for Americans, it's very confusing. When I say I'm from the state of Indiana, that's where I was born, I get, oh, don't you mean India? No, I do in fact know where I was born. It's from Indiana.
Like, also don't beat yourself up about it as well. Like, we're going to make mistakes. It's a learning curve. And also like we all have a responsibility to kind of take that personal inventory of like, how are we seeing people? What assumptions are we making?
I think not to try not to have any preconceived notions or ideas of who we think these people are or anyone is, without getting to know them for ourselves. I think we need to give people the opportunity we need to just try and get to know people, know more about their background, maybe their experience.
I've had people assume that I prayed on the floor, so they were nervous about me moving into their dorm in uni. And that's the kind of thing that just wouldn't be said to a white person. So I think if you want to ask questions, just ask without any assumption. You know, it's absolutely fine. I'm happy for people to ask me, what's your background? I totally welcome that. I don't love hearing, what are you? That's not really a nice way to find out about someone.
But pray for God to reveal and convict of sin. Like, we know conviction of sin is a really healthy and good thing. Like, it's a sign of us like growing in holiness. And like Psalm 32 kind of talks about the weight of holding your sin and not acknowledging it to God. So I think, first just kind of praying.
When all of this kind of dies down, like, it's still relevant, and like still keep reading those books, keep like keeping up to date in what's happening in our country, in America. And just don't be silent if a co-worker says that like racial slur, or someone just says a comment, even if you're in Tesco or whatever, like, stand up and don't let it kind of just get brushed underneath the rug.
I mean, again, there's so much positive about our church when it comes to how they deal with us different colored people. I think they're so proactive in getting to know all of us and mixing with us, finding out about us. So that's kind of educating in every level, not just educating children about different races, but even at any age, they are still learning, and they're happy to adapt and change their way of thinking. So we are really grateful for that. But I think it's more of that living and mixing with people in different backgrounds, not being so cautious about. Sometimes they'd be cautious because they worry about, I might be politically incorrect or racist in any. I don't want to come out as racist in any way. So that draws them back a bit. I think they become cautious about it. So not to be afraid. Like Nikki said, we don't bite. Get to know us and get to know our culture and everything. I think that'd be more encouraging for all of us.
Jesus' pattern in the Gospels is that Jesus teaches and then he acts. He often said the thing and then he did the thing. And we know that our calling as believers is to be like Jesus and model Jesus. And I think we need to model Jesus in that sense of we have to talk about racism, but we also need to do the hard work ourselves. Like, if we see someone or we hear something being said, like, what are we doing to help enable God's justice in that situation?
And so I hope that just this time has been helpful to all of us to kind of just get a sense of what it's like for people from the BAME community, people in our church who are experiencing this stuff. And my prayer is really that this is a time that has really encouraged you and enabled you to kind of access and process for yourself and to learn for yourself what it might be like for other people, which you may not have known otherwise. So come on, let's keep being the church, let's keep bringing hope to our community. We know that we have a God who's over all things. We know that our Gospels and our Acts share actually the early disciples struggling and battling with this issue. Do they go to the Gentiles or don't they? And do you know what? Jesus shines through in his example as he meets with different people from different genders, different races, different cultures, different backgrounds, and he shows his love to them all because hope matters. So thanks so much for listening. and yeah, see you all soon.